Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? I always thought it'd be cool to have a secret identity. I grew up reading things like Spider-Man and comics like that, and these guys had secret identities, and I thought that was pretty cool, and I wanted to be pretty cool. But the closest I ever got was, besides wearing this cool Star Wars hat, was having a first name Ivan, which was kind of unusual. But I tell you what, it wasn't so cool when you were growing up in America during the Cold War. That's a different story. Kind of an unfortunate name to have at that time. But I found some people have secret identities. Turns out Bankbar Como and Justin Rio on the RPG Facebook Brigade page, well, they're the same person. And talking to him, turns out he's got like 18 other aliases. So he's really cool. He's got multiple secret identities. So we can only hope to be as cool as he is. It's something to look forward to. But he asked some great questions. And so he asked me an interesting question, which I thought was worthy of some discussion, about the final video I did on my series about like how to play OSR games. And this question really applies to a lot more than like OSR games. So it's really kind of useful or interesting to talk about because I think it represents some different schools of thought in the gaming community, period. And so he asked me, like, why would you choose one of these systems? And I was talking about at that time, like the fact that they don't necessarily provide the experience you want. Like you have to put some legwork in. They don't mechanically inform like a really narrative style of play. They don't mechanically inform something that might be really character driven, or in this case, they're not super gamist, that sort of thing. So if you want a particular game experience, you guys really need to work at making this experience for yourselves. So he's saying, well, if there's this session zero, and we're working to get this type of experience you want, but there's other systems that have this experience packaged in, why would you suggest someone to use this, one that doesn't have it packaged in instead? And so it's not just old school games. There are other kind of, I guess you call them rules light games, which, do this. And I kind of mentioned, well, freedom. It was my first answer. Was that your final answer? That was my answer. And he asked, well, what do you mean? Like freedom to change rulings, freedom to play multiple types without buying another system? And they said, what do you think about the idea that a tool designed specifically for a job will do the job better than a tool designed for multiple jobs? I said, well, I don't know, man. All I got is a vice grips. But of course, a tool designed for one job will do that job specifically much better than other tools. I'm not disputing that at all. For me, part of the freedom is, and this is just my perspective, is it's the freedom to kind of change focus. There's a few different freedoms I was talking about, as I kind of just said that off the cuff. The first freedom for me has been, and this kind of relates to my amount of rules preference, is I like to have freedom from the book. I don't want to be constantly referencing a book. And so the more of a system a game has, and the more complex that system is, the more I have to kind of look at the book or remember it or have to do mathematical operations. And I'm not saying that's all bad, but there's a point where I don't want to be chained to the book. And I understand too, there's a learning curve and then you kind of inherently know it, but I like a little freedom from the book. The second thing is like the ability to change focus on a dime. And I talked about that a little bit. I know I've had probably way too many videos talking about this already, but I wrote something really clever. I want to make sure I remember that because old age, you don't remember these things. But I want to be able to change focus on a dime without worrying about abandoning the mechanic. If I want to play a real person in a real world, all I really want is some resolution mechanics. They don't have to be really complex, but I want the freedom to explore or interact in the world, as I will, and the ability to kind of change my focus at will, or as a party we end up changing our focus at will. So even though we may have gone into it initially, I don't know, like deciding we were going to explore one thing, if we all of a sudden find something else interesting, the ability to kind of like agree to change gears is cool. And it's cool to have a mechanic that supports a particular style of play, and I'm not knocking that at all. But then if we're involved, midstream, and all of us are kind of saying, what, we'd really kind of like to explore something else, the ability to sort of do that is neat. Now, the thing with a session zero is, you can sit down with one of these games, and I have the most experience, obviously, with these, old school retro clones and the like. But it would apply to something, I suppose it would apply to something like Fudge or whatever. Some of the other rules light things I've kind of looked at or played a little bit, is the idea that you want to have a really narrative sort of game. Well, you can. You want to have something that's really story driven. Well, for crying out loud, all you have to do is look at the module railroads from back in the day, or even some of the modules that people are producing for the retro clones now. You could play your entire campaign or game where the game master is this big giant story arc, and you kind of not necessarily supply dialogue. You get to be involved in it. But if you want this big story arc, and you want the game master to kind of supply the story, and you guys go and interact in it and become the big heroes, but there's a definite end, you could do that. You know, it doesn't matter, whether the game has that, as canon or not. If you want to have big story story arcs for your characters, well, yeah, you guys decide this is what it's going to be about. The important thing in this game or any game is to not end up annoying each other. And I don't know if you ever had this experience, sitting next to somebody where they're the only one that's really interested in this big giant character arc, and we really didn't have this discussion, but now it's constantly about their backstory and everything else, and you're sitting there, dude, like, we did not show up to do theater today. I'm not picking on anybody, but because you could just as easily be sitting next to the guy who wants to have big tactical discussions. Well, that's not the optimal thing to do here. Let's sit there and run the numbers, and everybody wants to strangle the guy. I digress, but you get the idea. So, for me, like I said before in the videos, at one point, the biggest feature of games like those is also its biggest flaw, the fact that it can kind of do anything, and it is cool because you can change direction, but it also can be a bit of a flaw because you have to put the legwork in there, and also somebody can throw it off course. You have to be careful with that too. So I'm not just going to be an apologist for the games or that style of play. I freely admit there are limitations and there are drawbacks. So that's just kind of at least my perspective and some of my experience with why I'd want to choose, or why I like a game like that. Like I wouldn't necessarily want to. I don't want to say it's better or worse, but that's just what the experience is going to be like. It's not terrible. It's a different thing if you're going to play a game that has a very prescribed, very narrow focus, like this is what's going to happen. Something like Circle of Hands, probably a great example. There's a really prescribed way to play that game, and I haven't done it yet, but it looks pretty freaking cool. But you don't go outside those parameters. You really don't. I mean, you kind of break the game. It's not going to be the same experience. And there's a really codified way to do it. That's not bad. But there's other times I want to play in something that's wide open, and we can change our focus quite a bit. So that's for me, that's the reason that I would want to play in a game like that. I'm not constrained by the conceits of the game or the really narrow focus. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not constrained by I'm not tied to the rule book because there's so much stuff. And if we want to change focus entirely, like literally I've been involved in campaigns where we started out kind of involved in this, like, I guess you'd call it a story arc that the game master had, to all of a sudden we became much more interested in some political machinations and nation versus nation stuff, and some really backhanded stuff. We changed focus. We found that more interesting. And we had the freedom to do that because it was not definitely going to be this narrow focus. So, yeah, that's freedom. Braveheart was right. So that's why it's part of the allure of those games. Not better, not worse, just different. So hopefully that answered some of the questions. And yeah, sure, big toolbox, better than vice grips, but sometimes you just want to hit some stuff with the vice grips. Kill some orcs that way.